this? Salmon? Salmon, perhaps.
Why is it sideways?
Orange-ish. Burnt. Orange, maybe. What? What color?
Coral.
What color?
Coral.
Coral. You think that's coral?
I say coral.
Coral. Understand my color palette. Alright, the other one is the PreResponse. We will reference these, a couple of these throughout today's show. So make sure you have those two things. A reminder on the gotta knows. At Hopkins High School, they teach that there are 3 linkage institutions: political parties, interest groups, and media. Here at Naperville Central, we'll tell you there are 4. Political parties, interest groups, media, and elections and campaigns. Elections and campaigns should, I would argue, share its own column. Even though we will cover these 3 in depth, weaved into all 3 of these is parties and campaigns. So we're going to start with the political spectrum. It's one of the things we started with on the very first day when you took those I side with surveys, political compass, etc. And we're going to describe political linkage institutions. What is a linkage institution is the first, most basic question I would ask. What the heck is a linkage? Well, a linkage institution is any institution that connects the electorate, the American citizenry, and their government, right? Because the one institution affects the other. We create, and remember Federalist 51, what is government but a reflection on human nature? We create the government. We make it. We elect the guys who pass the laws. So that's what I want to talk about today. What do they do? How do they function? Right? How do they affect government? First thing I'm going to talk about is a political spectrum. Now, this is like an underpinning of everything else. We know that from the French Revolution, when you walked in and went to the right, you were considered a conservative. To the left, you were considered a liberal in our parlance today. On the right, we have polemics like Ann Coulter. A polemic is someone who argues, essentially for argument's sake. One of her books, If the Democrats Had Any Brains, They'd Be Republicans, and such a sweet thing. And then, of course, you have Al Franken, who is now a U.S. Senator from Minnesota. Rush Limbaugh's a big fat idiot. That's quite a name for a book. Examples of liberal and conservative. Here's a political spectrum as we know it, right? Right-wing conservatives tend to share this demographic characteristic. They tend to be WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, self-described Christian or evangelicals. They tend to be rural or middle America, the country club conservative types. Over here we have urban, coastal, non-Christian, women, blue-collar minorities. This is how historically it is lined up. Now, are there some people here that are over there and vice versa? Yes. But this used to be the general bell curve of the American populace. One of the questions is, as America gets more polarized, is this becoming something like a 2-hump camel, where we have a big hump of people over here and people over here, and people who are actually conservative or actually independent is actually going down. Well, how can that be, Mr. Borshensky? As you said in class, about 40% of Americans say they're independents. About a third say self-described conservative Republicans, and a third say liberal Democrat. Because of party ID, if I can figure out your party ID, I can predict who you will vote for on an almost consistent basis. So even those people who claim to be independent, I could whittle that 40% down by a series of, if I could just sit you down and talk to you. You do have a leaning one way or the other, which is why I would take that 40% and parse it into 10, 20, 10, 20, 10. So 30% on either side, plus that 10% that leans, and the 20% who are kind of in the middle, that are the ones responsible for split ticket voting, and would be as close as a real independent as you're going to get. these are on the library website, the LibGuide for AP Gov. And we will put them on Canvas. So if whatever I don't get to, make sure you go back and review these. You need to be reviewing the Gotta Know sheets. You need to be reviewing your book, that study book that you got, the gray one. Take all the practice tests, read every page of that booklet, reread chapters in your book. All those practice tests we're giving you are done for a reason. And attend all these review sessions. These are all really important. All right, so really, the four big things down here. How do we solve problems? How do we adjust our tax rate so that it does what it's supposed to and yet doesn't drown the American taxpayer? How do we handle social issues? And what should the role of government be? Liberals and conservatives differ on those very fundamental questions, which is why we agree on the very top stuff like, do we want clean air? Well, duh, we all do. How are we going to go about empowering an agency like the EPA to do that? Right, that's where we disagree. I would argue that most Americans, if you really dig down into it, have political consensus. And you would not get that if you watch Fox or MSNBC or CNN. All you hear is these people argue, which is a shame. We have polemics on the radio like Hannity on TV or Rush Limbaugh who tell you that the other side is not legitimate. And that doesn't do political discourse any good by demonizing the other in a political conversation. You know, this hyperpolarity is not helping us out. The first institution that has evolved as American history has moved on is the political parties. And the two dominant political parties that we have to this day are Democrats and Republicans. Let me review their primary purpose. Let me read this little box right here. Remember, this is the big tent. Think of the big giant circus tents of old. Political parties, in this case Republicans or Democrats, exist for one purpose: to win elections. Notice I did not say to stay politically consistent or ideologically consistent. Their job is to control government through the winning of elections. Let me say that again. Their purpose of existence is to control government through the winning of elections. Governed by pluralities, which are groups of people inside, this helps to explain why only two parties dominate. Yet they perform functions beyond just selecting candidates. Political parties select, sort, organize the electorate. Right? So we told you they perform a lot of functions. Political parties provide a label, number one. In fact, I'll get to that in a second on the top slide. They provide a label. That little R, that little D next to my name on a ballot says volumes about it in your mind. Perceived value about what, therefore, that thing means about me. Political parties slate candidates, inform and activate voters, act as a watchdog on the party in power. The Republicans are the watchdog on Obama. Keep an eye on it. So they provide all those functions at the same time. We didn't always have just the Democrats and Republicans. You know, we first had the two factions at the Constitutional Convention, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Then we had Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Then for a short time, there was only the Democratic Republicans, and then the Democratic Republicans and the Whigs collapsed, and the Republicans rise up as a third party. And now we have the Democrats and Republicans. We'll go to that through that in a second. So I like to think of political parties as big circus tents with lots of different clowns inside. Mr. Smith would probably have said a big tent with a food fight going, right? I just think it's cute that the one wags his tail, the other with the nose. Isn't that cute? Vote Republican, it's easier than thinking. Vote Democrat, it's easier than working. Yeah. The donkey. The elephant. Remember, they were actually kind of pejoratives. They were kind of making fun of the two political, that political cartoonist, Mr. Nast, was making fun of the two parties, and they actually liked the animal that was chosen to represent them, and they kept them, and they've been the same ever since. So it's a pachyderm and an ass. Speaking of the ass, the Democrats, There are lots of different factions inside the Democratic Party. In fact, at one point it was so huge. The Democratic Party historically was bigger than the Republicans. That's coming like this now. It was huge. The joke was, I'm not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. It had so many different factions. Depending on where you live, the Democratic Party in Mississippi looked nothing and acted nothing like the Democratic Party in Oregon, which acted nothing like the Democratic Party in New York. They were almost entirely different. They probably didn't know how to even talk to each other. Here we have a couple of factions, right? Congressional Progressive Caucus, that used to be led by this guy Kucinich, who's gone now. That's the liberal wing. That's the Bernie Sanders wing, even though he was never really a Democrat, right? He was a socialist or an independent most of his career until now. Then you had the Blue Dog Democrats. Blue Dog Democrats were pro-gun, pro-life, conservative Southerners, for the most part, who stayed in the Democrat, who were in the Democratic Party. Yes, there are actual conservative, pro-life, pro-gun guys in the Democratic Party. They're called Blue Dog Democrats. And they're generally from the South. Remember, when the South decoupled itself from the Democratic Party, it was entirely Democratic. Then we see evolution start to take place, and the Democratic Party embraces civil rights and other issues. And that group doesn't change its ideology, it changed its party label from D to R, which is why we see a huge realignment in the South from Democrat to today, Republican. Two states that didn't have, I think, a single Republican in the early 1900s were Alabama and Mississippi. Now I don't think there's a single Democrat. Maybe one or two. It's like seeing a unicorn. Howard Dean and his 50-state strategy. Howard Dean was the head of the Democratic National Committee for a long time. So there's lots of different factions in the Democratic Party, just like there's lots of different factions inside the Republican Party. Right? Another big tent. We have the Club for Growth, which is almost libertarian, like pro-business, leave the business group alone. Christian Coalition, huge. Mr. Bauer and others organized the grassroots defending our Christian heritage. Then you have the Liberty Caucus, which is kind of a libertarian wing. You have the Conservative Activist Toolbox for Restoring Constitutional Government. The National Review is a conservative magazine for many, many years, still around to this day. So all these groups existed, and they argued with each other. In fact, in the Republican Party, if you were called the Rhino, anybody know what Rhino stands for in the Republican Party? It's a put down. Oh, you're a Rhino. It means Republican in name only. It means you're not a true Republican, and then, depending on what faction you were in, they would throw that label on the other guys. All these other guys were not real Republicans. One that's also being thrown at Trump, right? All right. This is where elections and campaigns come in. That's that fourth linkage institution I talked about. Occur when groups of voters permanently change their party preference in large amounts. And there have been those heavy realignment periods. I'm only going to talk about three. Number one is 1800. 1800 was the election of Jefferson. He ran against the incumbent Adams. So John Adams is running against Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson had created a new political party called the Democratic Republicans. And not only does Jefferson and his partner Madison sweep the elections, take control of both houses of Congress and the presidency, they pretty much wipe out the Federalists. And Adams, we know, promises a guy named Marbury a job. Remember Marbury versus Madison? Remember that case? That came out of the election of 1800. The Federalists would dissolve away, and the Whigs would rise up in their place. That's one of the great transitions of the election of 1800. The Whigs would then collapse. I'm going to skip to 1860. The Whigs would collapse, being unable to control as the nation literally tore itself apart. And a young, small political party formed outside of government. The Democratic Party formed inside government. Thomas Jefferson was an elected official. Republicans grew as a third party outside of government. Remember the Republican Party, old Whigs, free soilers, anti-slavery abolitionists, coalesced around a bunch of guys by the name of Seward and Chase and others, and a young lawyer from Illinois, who I argue is the last Whig president, Abraham Lincoln. And I argue Grant is the first truly Republican president. But that young lawyer joins the Republican Party, wins the nomination. And in a four-way race, they split the electorate, and Lincoln becomes president. So the war ensues. The nation is literally transformed with the blood of the hundreds of thousands who perished. And it leads to the rise of the Democratic Party, which would become the dominant party. And that would occur with that dude's election the first time in 1932. This is the third election I'm talking about, where Franklin Roosevelt puts together the most unlikely electoral coalition and probably the most successful electoral coalition, because how many times is FDR elected president? 4 times. Now, he broke the two-term tradition. I got it. 22nd Amendment would take care of that. But even though he got less popular at each time, he still was elected 4 times. No other person in American history can say that, because he stitched together an unlikely coalition. At the same time, African Americans and Southern whites, who were pro-segregation for the most part, were in the same political party. They both voted for FDR, as did unions and union workers in the inner city, and ethnic people like my family that lived in the city of Chicago, in the Polack neighborhoods, right? They all voted Democrat. It was the thing to do, right? It was the country club Republicans that lived in the farms and in the suburbs. Those guys were the Republicans. You were a union guy, you voted Democrat. And that held together for a long time until we see the realignment of the South, and the Republican Party makes steady inroads, and the Democratic Party declining to where they're pretty equal. And now some states are strongly Democratic, and some states are like blue, and some states are strongly Republican, and they're red. All right. What's the fundamental goal again of a political party?
Win election.
Win election. Control government through the winning of elections. That's their goal. Take a look at this first pre-response question. One of the things you are going to get is you're going to get questions that look like this. It's how these two institutions interact. In this case, interest groups and political parties. Let me quickly read this. It says, while interest groups and political parties each play a significant role in the United States political system, they differ in their fundamental goal. We know B. Excuse me, this is right there. Fundamental goal of a major political party in the political process. We know that, right there. What's the major goal of interest groups in the political process?
Policy. Will affect policy.
Yeah, influence policy, right? Influence the creation of public policy. They don't wish to create it, they wish to influence it. But then it says to describe, how do these two intersect? Describe 2 ways in which different interest groups support the fundamental goal of political parties. And then it says use that information in C. For one of the forms of support you describe in C, explain 2 different ways in which that form of support helps interest groups to achieve their fundamental goal. Do me a favor. Take 30 seconds with your neighbor, approximate neighbor to your right or to your left. See if you can answer C or D verbally, and then, and only then, turn it over and read the rubric. Do that now. All right, check out the rubric, see if you were right. By the way, there's nothing more fun at a birthday party than whipping out a few FRQs and have a go-around to see who can write the best FRQ. And we're giving you all of these FRQs arranged by subject matter. So you want to have a party, and you want to have everybody who's cool showing up, you make sure you get out there on your social media. It's going to be an FRQ party. Come all, bring your FRQs. Oh, dude, it's going to be awesome. What time should I be there? What time should I be there? Peter, what time should I be there?
Oh, okay, hold on. I'm gonna make invitations, I'll make sure to send them.
All right, oh yeah, right. I've heard that before. I'll make sure you get one. By the way, think federalism when you think political parties, because political parties are decentralized. There's no one, there are 50 different Republican parties and 50 different Democratic parties because the state parties are different. They are linked at the top with the national committee in Washington. But think federalism. Each state is sovereign. All right, how do parties act as a linkage institution? Well, one big one is the second bullet, actually. They provide a label, right? They do have a constellation of ideological connections. Guys in the Republican Party have some shared values, which is why they identify themselves as Republican. Democrats, the same thing. Party ID, party identification, is the primary means by which we decide what party we align with, who we are going to support. All right? There are people who split ticket vote, and that's the rise of independence. Even people who lean Democrat or Republican occasionally will vote for the opposition party. Right? That's how political parties are weakening. One of the things that you can see is how parties have weakened. Let me give you two examples. One of the great things political parties did, which I thought was so effective, because they're non-ideological for the most part, is that they have lots of different factions, right? And they made these factions come together, and they had to work together, so you couldn't be this super right-wing, left-wing party over here, the Democrats are the super right-wing party over here, because you had a whole plurality of people inside. It's pluralism at its best, all these different groups inside, and the parties softened the more stringent ideological people inside the party because they had to get elected. Political parties have had trouble serving that function today because apparently you have to be more conservative than the other guy to get elected in the Republican Party or more liberal in the Democratic Party. So hyperpolarity has weakened parties, as has structure and function, which we'll get to in just a second. I would argue parties are too weak. Mr. Priebus, the head of the Republican Party, cannot choose who can run as a Republican and who cannot. I mean, come on. The party can't choose its own candidates. We do in primaries. Same thing with the Democrats. Here's the structure part of why they're weakening. The rise of the independent voter. Interest groups have skyrocketed. The number of interest groups has skyrocketed. I guarantee you, you have a family member or a friend who's a member of some interest group. But I dare say find a family member or a friend who's actually a member of one of the two political parties. Most of you can name an interest group that you guys like or are interested in. But all of us, you have people that are pro-Republican or pro-Democrat but are not members. Split ticket voting is huge. Remember Durberger's law. There are structures that make it impossible or very hard for third parties to come in. One, plurality voting, single member districts, winner take all. Plurality voting, single member districts, winner take all. All of these institutions, or these structures that we have built into our elections, have given rise to a two-party system and have kept third parties out. Other weakenings. We went from a civil service, we went from a spoils system and a patronage system, where to the victors go the spoils. If you won the election, you come in, all of the old party goes out, you bring in all your party buddies, and you have patronage, which you get to give all these jobs. That was changed by the Pendleton Act and we now evolved into a civil service system. So patronage was lost by political parties. There's way less party discipline. If you want to buck the system, there's little the party can do about it. Right? Fewer party caucuses. Party members like caucuses because actual party members show up. They like closed primaries where you have to commit to one of the two political parties. In a state like Illinois where it's open primary, you can vote for whomever you want, whenever you pick up any ballot you want. They hate those, right? And Americans are used to shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter sound bites. We used to be able to watch news shows that were 60 minutes long and have in-depth conversations. Then we went to 30 minutes. Now, if your social media is too long, you just scroll down until you get to the short one with the cute picture. Right? So, all right. I'm going to skip this one for now, so I'm going to come back to it. Third parties. I already talked about systematic barriers. Number one, one more time. Single member districts, only one person can win. Plurality voting. All you have to do is get the most votes out of the entire county. You don't need a majority. And number three, winner take all. All you can do is I'll vote you and I get all the electoral votes, right? In certain cases. There are also political barriers. If you want to get on the ballot in Illinois and you're not a Democrat or Republican, which automatically get on the ballot, some states require a certain number of signatures. You must acquire a certain number of signatures before your name can be placed on the ballot. Or, in the previous election, you must have received some percentage of the vote. If you have, then your party can remain on the ballot for next year. That's very hard. If you know as a third party, you're only going to get 1, 2, 3, 4% of the vote. You're not going to win. So how are you going to convince people to vote for you if in a single member district, only one person can win? Why would you waste your vote? Let's look at the next FRQ with the political cartoon. Please take a look at it. See if you can identify who the person is speaking and what the woman behind her is doing with her ballot. Ralph Nader was the presidential candidate for the Green Party. And it says, we've got to put an end to our society's throwaway mentality. And there she is with her ballot, throwing it away because it's a Green Party vote. It's a third party, right? What kinds of third parties are there? Well, there's ideological parties like communism, socialism. There's single issue parties. Prohibition Party was a single issue party. It's a little more complicated than that, but essentially, yes. There were splinter parties, right? The Bull Moose Party of Teddy Roosevelt breaks away from the Republicans, hurting the Republicans in the 1914 election, allowing the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win. And finally, there's economic protest parties. There used to be a group called the Greenbacks, right? And the Gold Party or the Silver Party, and the economic protests of the Great Depression and era prior. All right. For number 3, it says, minor parties or third parties have a common feature in American politics. Describe the point of view expressed about minor parties in the political cartoon above. So you can answer A. B. Identify and explain how 2 rules in the American electoral system are obstacles. And 3. Minor parties make important contributions. Describe 2 contributions. Take 15 seconds. See if you can answer all 3 of those real quick and then turn it over because the rubric is right here. Check out the rubric right now. What are the structural, systematic barriers? What did I say? Number 1, winner-take-all aspect. Number 2, ballot access. Actually, I put that as political. Number 3, campaign finance. Federal funding of presidential elections, that's not really a thing. It's only the exception. Single-member plurality districts. And the second question, what role do they play? New or different ideas. If you were in my class, you learned about Dr. Francis Townsend. Remember him, guys? Say yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. He was the guy that started the Social Security Party, Dr. Townsend. advocated for Social Security, remember that? The Democrats swoop in, take that issue of Social Security, we now have Social Security. Today, we don't have a Social Security party, and you've never heard of Dr. Francis Downs. But thank God he was around, because now Grandma gets some of her Social Security money. All right. All right, interest groups. Number 2. Interest groups, number 1 goal is to influence policy, to influence representatives' thoughts on issues and laws. Their number 1 job is to educate, inform, contour the political conversation on a given issue. These guys generally don't run for office. And as I stated earlier, you know people in interest groups. I know you do. You may not know anybody who's actually a member of one of the 2 political parties. The 4 M's.
Party. Go back to slide. Isn't this like on campus?
It is. It's all on Canvas, guys. It's going to be on Canvas. It's already on the website. So you don't need to type this stuff verbatim. It's already out there for you. You don't have to recreate the wheel. If you go onto the website today, you can be following along with me slide for slide and probably make comments on each slide. So I guess that's what I would. Right? 4 M's. What can interest groups do? They can influence by political action committees, the legal tool they use to donate money to both political parties, campaigns. 2, grassroots mobilization, organize people to act. Number 3, media, advertise, particularly free media. You can get free media. If you get the newspaper to come out or the TV, if you turn on the Channel 5 News tonight, and I'm out here with a walk for X. And so why did you do the walk for X? What's the pink breast cancer, right? The walk to 39 miles. They do lots of commercials, and then they interview the person who's running it. The Chicago Walk for 39 miles. We're doing this to end breast cancer. That's an interest group, guys. They influence policy, right? And finally, number 4, meetings. They actually do the old-fashioned outside, this mobilization, the outside route of influencing. This is the inside route. Actually sitting down, old-fashioned lobbying style of actually meeting with representatives. Right? What is their stock in trade? Information. And since interest groups are not covered under the Federal Election Communications Act, FECA, they can expressly advocate for an idea and can do so without limit. There are no dollar limits to the amount of money they can spend. So interest groups have a unique advantage. The political parties don't. And they also, lastly, do endorsements. Remember, they rate congressmen from 1 to 100, 100 being the best congressman you could possibly get, 1 being, this guy's worthless. You know, the biggest environmental polluters are Representative Boshinsky from Naperville, or, or something like that. And then they run commercials in your district saying, how could you vote for this guy? All right, what are some restrictions on interest groups? They have to disclose where their contribution and funding comes from. You are a reporter, or you could easily look up their finances. The Federal Election Commission does regulate that. If they want to lobby Congress, they have to register as lobbyists, or they have to hire. K Street, which is an actual street in Washington called K Street. I highly recommend you walk down if you want to work in DC, you're a young lawyer. That's where the lobbyists go. These guys are professional lobbyists who are hired by different organizations to represent them to members of Congress. And they make a good coin doing it. All right, they have limits on how much they can give. Revolving door, experts from Congress go to the private sector and then back into public service, and then private sector, public service, the whole revolving door effect. And supposedly it's illegal to bribe people. All right, let's talk access points. Interest groups can intersect with Congress through talking to their individual staffers. Talking to an actual congressman is hard. Remember, the stock and trade of an interest group is information. So, being an expert, remember I talked about when the FDA and the Department of Agriculture were deciding about changing the food pyramid into a plate. In comes the Dairy Compact and other dairy farmers who wanted to make sure milk stayed on there. I've heard the story if you're with me already. Well, they spent a lot of money and hired a lot of experts to walk in the door and say, I know about kids' development, and I'm telling you right now, kids need milk. So milk needs to stay in the food pyramid, and the 15,000 school districts that reference it, which is why when you walk in to the elementary school, what did you pick up when you walked into the cafeteria? You probably picked up a carton of milk, didn't you? Did you pick up orange juice, apple juice, water, Coca-Cola, a beer? No, you didn't. You picked up milk, and that's one of the reasons. All right, the executive branch. Information at agency hearings, that's what I just was talking about. Shaping public opinion and putting pressure on the president to react. The president actually put it out there. He said, if so many people sign up on the whitehouse.gov website, I will respond to a particular issue. I think it's 10,000 signatures or something like that. So there are ways that interest groups can put pressure on the president to discuss, develop policy matters, or solutions potentially to specific problems that the American people think is important. Finally, litigation is clear. Mr. McDonald, all of you talked about that case. Heller versus DC and McDonald versus Chicago. The NRA played a key role. The NRA, if I'm not mistaken, and I might be, paid for the lawyers for McDonald. They found them and said, dude, we love what you want to do. Here's some lawyers. They picked up the tab. The ACLU, we know, does that around. The American Civil Liberties Union uses litigation as one of its primary tools, right, to influence public policy. And we know that the Supreme Court can be influenced by the issuing of amicus curiae briefs, friends of the court briefs. So all ways that interest groups affect the judicial branch. All right. Interest groups serve to connect a particular interest that like-minded individuals who come together to join that group share with their elected or appointed representatives. Like political parties connect the electorate at the political parties in elections and campaigns. Connect the electorate, that's you and I who are voters, with government institutions. Interest groups represent their interests they seek to further, and they link that to their elected representatives. All right, so why do people join? Remember those PowerPoints we showed you? There's a lot of stuff about the Audubon Society on there. Why? Mr. Smith likes birds. That's the long and short of it. So why join? One, you want to help with the problem. If you recall, the many of you went to Government Day with us, there was a group out there, it was a climate group. They had a little table there. Does anyone remember the name of that group? What was the name of it? Do you remember?
Climate something lobby.
Yeah, Citizens Climate Lobby or something like that. If you were to walk up to their booth, they would say, would you like to put your name on this list? And if you do, we're going to start sending you material and email. We're going to send you a part of our group. So if climate change is something that's important to you, you just sign that piece of paper and voila. Why else might you join? Benefits. Number 3, solidarity. We call it solidarity. It's belonging to a group. The feeling that you're making a difference with like-minded individuals. And finally, you want to learn something. You want to join and make a difference. And I think that's awesome. And your First Amendment rights of speech and assembly and petition all point to your constitutional right to join a political party and be active in that party or in an interest group. I'm not going to do all of them. Post number 10 talked about factions and the control of factions. Parties and interest groups are ultimately factions. Remember when this was discussed, Washington was appalled that Thomas Jefferson and Madison created this political party called Democratic Republicans. He thought, how could you have your own personal interest above that of the state? Civic virtue. Well, ultimately, George would end up becoming, essentially by default, a Federalist in reaction to the Democratic Republicans. So to say that he didn't or wasn't a member of a political party, he was leaning Federalist. More in reaction to than loving the Federalists, more against the Democratic Republicans. Factions are part of human nature. We are joiners, right? So they're part of human nature, so you can't get rid of human nature. The only way you can get rid of faction is to get rid of freedom. Give everyone the same opinion, lock us all up, and give us all a book where all of our opinions are mooted out, like 1984, we're given the same opinions, we're given the same everything. That's, do you want to live that? He says that's worse than the problem of faction. So he says, pluralism is the answer. Large republics with lots of competing interests that compromises the underlying motive of all of them, and that's how we compete on policy issues and get stuff done. That's why Federalist number 10 is, if not the most famous. This one, Federalist 51, 78. They're the seminal pieces. I highly recommend you read all of the Federalist papers, but you've read a few. You know what an iron triangle is, right? Theoretically, you could probably draw one. An iron triangle includes a congressional committee, a bureaucratic specific agency, and an interest group, all connected by similar interests, similar jobs. And the one that we used a lot in our class was, there are two interest groups, the VFW and the American Legion, right? Representing veterans. Wounded Warrior Project is a third. Over here is the bureaucratic agency of the VA, the Veterans Administration. And over here is Veterans Affairs Committee in the House and or the Senate. All connected by a similar issue, right? We know that they're also called sub-governments. And the fact that there are now lots of interest groups that multiply out, it's one iron triangle connected after another, which is why they're now called policy networks. The interest groups play a role in all of them. All right, the media. Probably the most pervasive of all, and it's constantly evolving. It's like a river. Tributaries are constantly adding and subtracting from what the media is. The media used to be pamphleteers back in the day. Then there was radio and newspapers, and then there's radio, newspapers, and periodicals. And then there's radio, newspaper, periodicals, and television. And today there's radio, newspaper, periodicals, television, and social media. And that might even be more pervasive and huge. And they have three roles. Number one, gatekeeper. The national news media, by deciding to cover A over B, decide what you see on the news at night and what you and I will talk about the next day. Number two, they're the scorekeeper. Who's winning? Is it Trump or Cruz or Kasich? Or who's winning, Bernie or Hillary? Right? That's horse race mentality. Instead of discussing what they actually believe, you discuss who's ahead and who's behind and what poll. And finally, watchdog. Watch the government agencies to see if they are acting and doing the job they were asked to do. Here, this is Mr. Pulitzer, famous journalist and owner. He writes, "Our republic and its press will rise and fall together. An able, disinterested, public-spirited press will train intelligence to know the right and courage to do it can preserve that public virtue without which popular government is a sham and a mockery. A cynical, mercenary, demagogic press will produce in time a people as base as itself. The power to mold the future republic will be in the hands of journalists and future generations." I have great respect for journalists, actual journalists. There's a lot of phony ones on the internet who claim to be journalists. There's a lot of polemics out there. A polemicist is someone who just wants to argue their side only. They don't care about the give and take of social discourse. They just want to be right. And they don't care if what they tell is the truth. They just want to win. Most people on cable news networks, unfortunately, are on the polemic side. not on the actual journalists, which is why with Mr. Carlson, anybody taking journalism, continue to actually learn the difference between real journalism and anything thrown on the internet that's called journalism. They're two very different things. All right, historical examples of the media have been, originally newspapers were like a single sheet about yay big. Right, Ben Franklin was a printer. Those were called pamphleteers. And then they evolved into multi-page things called newspapers. Now here's the thing. Newspapers inform and entertain. And I've always asked the question, do newspapers sell news or do they sell you? Think about it. How do newspapers make money? They make money by selling advertisements. And here's what they say. Here's our circulation level. Here's how much we're going to charge. If you want to connect to these people through our newspaper source, you pay us money. And they get me to buy the newspaper by informing and entertaining me so that I buy the newspaper. You guys will get that same information through social media, whatever social media you choose. Right? It's evolved. The biggest change, I think, was radio. Not just printing. Printing is huge, but radio was cheap enough that everybody could afford to have radio. So radio became the first ubiquitous thing. Then it was television, and now it's social media of all of its forms, which used to be on the computer. I mean, look at this old dinosaur. Yeah, that's called a computer, a laptop. And now you guys, almost everything you guys consume will be through your phone. The internet. There's always the question, I don't think it's going to be on the test, but is media biased? General consensus, and I love when people say, well, the media, as if it's a single entity. Those on the right say that there is a left-wing tilt in the media. And that today we no longer have broadcasting. By the way, broadcasting and narrowcasting are actually agricultural terms. If you throw or you drop the seeds along one line, that's called narrowcasting. If you just throw the seeds out, it's called broadcasting. Today, old news services would broadcast to get as many viewers as they wanted. Today, they don't do that. They narrowcast. They tailor their news and their infotainment to a certain demographic that they want to attract. I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but I used to get Big and Tall magazines. Like selling clothes, catalogs for big and tall men. Because as you could probably tell, I'm both tall and growing bigger all the time. I'm absorbing some of the mass in the universe, apparently. It's a physics thing, mass can never be lost, it's just transferred. Well, I'm proof of that. And they catered to me because I would buy stuff and wear it from those stores. Well, news media does the same thing. A certain demographic they want. That's called narrowcast. And now watch, cable TV has made it so that everybody has their own channel. And what's balkanizing about this is, and troublesome for me in this editorial, is that now instead of us having a common social conversation about issues, you watch whatever you like, and that tells you exactly what you want to know and reverberates your own sentiments, and I watch mine. And we never have a conversation about public policy for all of us. So that's narrowcast. Political cartoon, this is my favorite one right here. There's Fox News in bed with the elephant and then the donkey, CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, and these people are all calling them a slut. Which is a bad thing to call someone. I'm looking for copies of the New York Times. That would be the fiction section. The left says media is just as liberal as the corporate owners let it. So the right wing says all the media, all of those guys are a bunch of liberal wackies who distort the news. The left says, no, the news is just as liberal as the corporate owners allow it to be. The fact is that media is more and more being purchased by major multinational corporations and that they're consolidating. Here's an example. Originally, you have all these news outlets that have merged or been bought out and consolidate, till very few of them come out. And so if a guy in a boardroom is deciding what news, who's not unelected, and he's deciding which news is or is not going to make it onto my news cable channel, how does that influence the news? And that's kind of the left-right take on the media. The right says they're all a bunch of liberal commies. The left says, well, they're all owned by corporations. Are corporations left-wing? I doubt it. And here's your consolidation right here, guys. Please, if you get a minute, take a look at this chart. Trying to govern it all is the Federal Communications Commission. And one of the things that they passed was the Telecommunication Act of 1996. Congress passed it, excuse me. It helps big conglomerates grow. It allowed a V-chip to be so you could manage what sites kids could see. It overturned the Supreme Court in ACLU versus Reno, which is about using strict scrutiny about what can be seen about freedom of speech. This was considered public welfare by some public service groups, like Ralph Nader and others. See this guy right here? This guy right in the middle? That dude? That's Colin Powell's son. And you might remember Colin Powell being the general of the United States Army during the first Gulf War. He was asked to run for president, first African American. He thought, well, no, not the first, but one African American who made it way up, was very well respected. His son entered politics, got on the FCC, made some pretty controversial decisions. This is one of those boards that's supposedly bipartisan, free of public influence. And there were if I remember correctly, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats on this committee that ran the FCC. And this thing about sound bites. It's the taste that represents the entire meal. That's the same. Sound bites and discussion on issues on news sources has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter over time. Political cartoon says the Gettysburg Address, and the reporter says, hey, can I have a sound bite? What does that say about the substance of political campaigns? That it's literally reduced to one sound bite from candidate A and the other sound bite from candidate B. Don't know. And finally, spin. Spin is where you present things that occurred that make the candidate bathed in the best light possible. There are spin doctors, spin rooms, candidates, whatever comes out of their mouth. The press secretary for the president says, well, what the president really meant was, or what Donald Trump really meant was, or what Hillary really meant, and these guys spin it in the back room. Usually they'll say, an unknown source from the campaign said. That's a person who calls up the reporter and says, I'm talking under the radar here, but here's what we want to get out. Right? That's part of the spin campaign by campaigns and governments. How does the president do it? He's got handlers in political campaigns. The president's got that person. The White House press secretary. Every day, Monday through Friday, the president's press secretary handles the press. And there's a huge press corps, so the president can massage his conversation or his take on a particular issue in a way that no other politician in Washington can. Keeps the press up to date on presidential doings, briefs the White House press corps, and is the primary spokesman for the president. Now, this young lady was the spokesperson for George W. Bush. We just updated the picture. Josh somebody is the current spokesman for Obama. Here's the press secretary for West Wing. Remember those West Wing episodes? All right, so once again, there are 4 Lincoln's institutions. The 2 big ones are political parties and interest groups. And the other one is media, and to a lesser degree, elections and campaigns. Thus endeth my show. Any questions? Does anybody need a late bus pass? They're in the box. If not, feel free to go.
What's your favorite color?
Blue.
Yes, good choice. Come on, good choice.